right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie Seltz, and I'm a principal with Prosono, a business strategy and social impact consulting firm in Denver, Colorado. And I am joined today by Casey Cortese, Managing Director of Schwab Community Services and the Charles Schwab Foundation. Casey is a client and a friend. More importantly, what Casey and the Charles Schwab Foundation and Schwab Community Services team, what they have done over the last few weeks to respond to COVID-19 has been beyond impressive. I've spent the last few weeks talking with CSR professionals and foundation leaders, and what Casey has done with her team really demonstrates leadership, clarity, and action, which can be challenging, especially in times of crisis. I wanted you to hear directly from Casey on what her and her team have done to take action. So welcome, Casey.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah. I imagine you were like the rest of us in March, watching the news and listening to our respective business leaders and government officials. Can you walk us through the foundation's approach in those first couple weeks?
Absolutely. We definitely were very concerned as we saw the enormity and the impact of the COVID crisis really affecting everyone everywhere. The size and scope of this type of a disaster is unprecedented and something we had never really seen before. So what we really wanted to do is make sure that we took the time to listen, to hear what was going on, to research what was happening at the expert level, look at what was happening globally, nationally, and locally, and take the time to really be able to assess in a thoughtful, deliberate, and strategic way as to what the needs were, and then what the company's capabilities were to respond at all levels. So it was a very complex time for us, but we wanted to make sure we did have that slow, thoughtful, methodical approach that would allow us to really make sure that we were responding in the most appropriate and the most impactful way possible.
Can you tell us a little bit about your foundation and the work of Schwab Community Services prior to COVID-19 pandemic, just so we have a better understanding of what's different now?
Absolutely. So the Charles Schwab Foundation is the primary philanthropic giving arm of the company, and we have two main focus areas. One is really working on advancing financial literacy across the U.S., and we work primarily with young people, trying to form and instill positive financial behaviors early on so that they can really think about achieving a lifetime of success. At the same time, we know how important it is to have our employee voice in our philanthropic giving, and so we also support causes where we have large numbers of employees engaged. And we do have about 20,000 employees across the U.S. In those efforts, we have several large national grant partners, such as Boys and Girls Clubs of America, Donors Choose, which is a crowdfunding platform for public school teachers, SIFMA Foundation, which is an industry organization that has a stock market investing game that simulates real life markets and therefore complementary financial literacy learning. And we do work in the college space with Colorado State University and Stanford. In addition, we have groups of employee volunteers across the country that act as our local giving arms. So they are given a budget every year, approximately $1 million out of our budget, where they can do local grant making, local charitable sponsorships, and then they're also our volunteer army and our champions of volunteerism. And in addition, the foundation is part of a bigger organization, Schwab Community Services, where we also think about our employee engagement strategies, our volunteerism, and we also do advocacy and consumer education work, all supporting that large mission of advancing financial literacy across the U.S. And that way we have both philanthropic dollars and corporate dollars, like many CSR groups do, so that we can utilize resources from both sides to really drive the biggest impact possible.
Got it. So in your words, then, what is different now?
Well, I'd say that we have always tried to be focused on really understanding and meeting the real needs of our communities and nonprofit partners. And I'd say that focus has really been dramatically amplified in this current environment. I think second, our and almost bigger, is that most of our traditional grant making and programming has been stopped or significantly delayed. So that's meant major shifts in our operational practices across the board. It has necessitated us moving away from supporting some of the traditional financial literacy work that we do and really thinking more holistically about the needs of our nonprofit partners, many of which are in survival mode right now. And, you know, as many foundations have done, we've unrestricted the grants that we've made to our regular partners. We've lifted many of the reporting requirements to ease that burden. In addition to that, we've adjusted our entire programmatic structure and operations to give our major nonprofit partners room and space to adjust to their new realities. And I think that this experience has pushed our entire team to be more nimble in our operations, certainly related to our COVID response specifically, but in a way that I think will help us in the long term.
Sure. I'm excited to kind of come back to that and in the tactics and how you did that in a little bit. But I'm curious, in some of my conversations with CSR professionals and executives and foundation leaders, most groups experienced some moment of pause. And how prepared or not an organization was really determined the length of that pause. In those first couple weeks, how did you know what to do?
Well, over time, we have really been working on evolving our strategic disaster response plan so that we really do have a solid process in place that allows us to evaluate disasters in a somewhat like-minded way and in as much of an objective way as possible. Of course, with a global event of this kind, you know, we've never seen a pandemic like this before. We have really had to adapt our approach, but having that solid process already formulated and in place over the last few years has allowed us to more easily adapt and to develop the right type of response. We also have a pretty strong culture of service here at Schwab, and that's been carefully and thoughtfully built over the years, and giving is now baked into our cultural DNA. So for us, it was never a question of if we'd respond, but it was more when we'd respond and how would we respond. And so watching and listening were key. The gut reaction can sometimes be to respond swiftly, but our years of experience collectively across the team have taught us that a swift reaction is not always an effective one. So a part of our practice is really to monitor a wide variety of trusted resources. So looking at the experts who are monitoring the actual impact on a global scale. What did this pandemic mean? How was it impacting individuals and communities and companies worldwide, nationally, locally? And then watching the effect and the impact it had on our employees, on our clients, the operational impacts to our business overall, how our corporate peers were reacting, and what were the needs of the nonprofits themselves. So we really wanted to make sure that as we thought about it, we were making a data-informed decision and that our response would be meaningful and easy to deploy to all of our recipients. So that meant waiting to make sure we looked at the expert analysis, that the greatest area of needs were identified, and that the relief agencies and our nonprofit partners had time to set up their response, create effective systems for responding, and then creating those partnerships with those organizations, because at the end of the day, we still have a fiduciary responsibility to our foundation and to our stakeholders to make sure we're giving well and we're giving in a way that's going to be effective. Along with that, we had to really be thoughtful and take a look at our assets. What tools and resources do we have available to us to deploy? And then once we gathered the right level of data and looked at the research, looked at the emotional state of our stakeholders as well, then we could take the time to act and know it was the right time to act. And then it was a matter of diving in, using all of that information and data to craft the best response possible.
I love it. So what I definitely hear is it's not a matter of if you should act, you already knew you should take action and where to listen from to help guide and inform. I'm curious, internally, was there anything hard as you were trying to decide?
Absolutely. I think the hardest thing is always balancing out that sense of urgency and the desire to respond swiftly with making sure you're responding effectively. We were inundated with questions about how we were responding from our employees, from our nonprofits, our key stakeholders. And with that came a lot of suggestions about how we might respond. And so we wanted to make sure we were responsive to them and take the time to listen to their ideas and suggestions and let them know where we were at in our process. But also balancing that out with the realities of the fact that we were having to pause our ongoing operations. So we were responding to things like canceling volunteer activities that had been planned, or speaking engagements at conferences, adapting to the shelter in place needs, and then really trying to ensure that we had a solid communication stream going back and forth between our stakeholders, and letting them know that while we didn't have the answer yet, we were in the process of formulating the answer. I think the other thing that's always challenging in a time like this is, unfortunately, we have limited resources. I think every company wishes they could give exponentially to their communities, especially in a time of crisis. And that's where I believe having a really solid strategic plan in place first allows you to respond strategically as well, and make sure that the assets and the resources you have are deployed as efficiently and effectively as possible.
So just kind of in the beginning, to summarize, what I heard you say very strongly was you took a moment to organize, not necessarily be the first ones out of the gate, and to really listen to all your stakeholders collectively. And then you looked at your assets, both your disaster recovery plan and your strategy, but then also your budget and your additional resources. I heard you say that you stayed grounded in that need and made sure actions were built on validity and not necessarily assumption, and that you took the time to formulate clear goals that were important to the foundation. Did I capture that correctly? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good, succinct summary.
I want to move us a little bit to, as you're crafting and formulating your plan, was there anything that you did to be strategic in the moment, in that pause? And maybe can you speak to some longer term goals that you had and how you were able to pull those goals into this time of crisis and response?
Absolutely. In terms of being strategic in the moment, I think it goes back to having that well thought out disaster plan. We actually have a matrix that we use to try and be like-minded and objective in our decision making, so that we know that there could be another disaster, hopefully not another one of this size, but we always need to be ready to deploy those assets thoughtfully. And if we can make sure that we're being objective in every disaster related decision, then we know that our resources will be more effective when they're put into action. I think a couple of things related to some of the goals that we had that we were able to pull into our overall plan is, one, we knew that we had a challenge in terms of our overall communications with our employees, that we communicate frequently, but we have a challenge breaking through the clutter of all the information that's flowing through a large organization. And like a lot of companies do, we rely heavily on email as a conduit for sharing information. But when you get hundreds of emails a day, sometimes you can't see everything and you can't read it all. And as a matter of fact, we did the strategic review with you with Prosono last year, and that really emphasized the need to figure out how to communicate better and more effectively. And so this whole COVID situation really amplified the need for that and the urgency around that. And so we have started talking with our internal partners to look at what communication platforms do we have that we haven't used well in the past, and how can we redesign a communication system that will allow us to be more nimble in updating our employees on opportunities, on impact, that will be more nimble for them to self-serve. So when they have a question, they'll know where to go. They don't have to email us and wait for a response in return. And that it will be much more robust and comprehensive so that people can really understand the fullness of what we do. And one of the impacts to the pandemic is we had to cancel our annual volunteer week of service. And this new communication tool will be vital to us as we rethink and re-envision what volunteering is going to look like, because it's going to be more nimble, and this communication system will allow us to be nimble along with it. Mm. And then the other thing I think is just creating better integration with our other business partners. I think all CSR professionals know that many different business units in a firm contribute to your citizenship practices. And so we've really looked at how we can better align with some of our other business units' goals and objectives. For example, we're talking with our human resources group to see how they're defining and measuring employee engagement. And can we look at employee engagement through their lens as opposed to just through the lens of our single programs, and then show the value of our programs in that broader perspective of what quality engagement looks like and how that aligns with business needs. So just a couple examples there.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious, pre-COVID-19, had you already started looking at that platform, and as a result of COVID-19, you were able to move it forward? I don't want to give the perception that, you know, you're all the way through the process of launching that, but just clarity of pre and more current state, if you will.
Yeah. We actually had not started researching. We had identified the need. We knew we needed to do it, but it hadn't risen to the top of our priority list. And then the COVID-19 situation just really raised it up the chain. And we also were able to identify some experts in Schwab that can help us move that forward. We, I think, sometimes tend to be insular and look at our own team to do everything for everybody, but this is a unique way that we can use the talents and expertise of our employees to help advance our community work. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to always be serving the nonprofits, but if we have experts that can build our systems and practices and allow us to do our work better, that is a great way to engage employees in your work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And same with the employee engagement. It seems like COVID-19 and those metrics that elevated the conversation to rise to the top there too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Casey, how big is your team? How were you able to make the impact that you have been and really be strategic in this time of crisis?
Yeah. So in our entire community services team, there's 11 of us, and we have, we're very fortunate to have a communications team specifically, and they do a lot of the work around consumer education, managing our social channels, really amplifying the quality, the value, and the impact of our work. And then on my team, which is the program side of the house, there are 4 of us that work to manage the national relationships, all of our grant-making strategies. And so we partner very closely and effectively with our communications team to really make sure that the work is being shared properly. We have an expert on employee communications in the community services team, for example. So what I think was great about our reaction to this is that everybody pulled together and everybody on the team brought their unique skill set and expertise to think comprehensively and holistically about how we were responding. The communication staff reminded us to be very thoughtful about the timing of how we talk to people, ensuring that we were never tone deaf in terms of when our messaging would go out, and being crisp and clear and succinct in how we talked about our work. And the programs team, they knew where to reach out for the expertise, to look at best practices, to look at that data-driven need, and to understand how we could activate the need to serve our communities, but also to serve the desire of our employees to give back.
I love it. I love it. And in all this, how did you know that you had a good strategy?
You know, I think that there are a couple key things, and that's really the holy grail question that all CSR practitioners are trying to define and achieve. So a few things. First, does your strategy clearly articulate the problem you're trying to solve and the value that you bring in solving it? Is your strategy outcome driven? Do you start with outcomes first versus tactics and programs first to make sure you're actually providing that value? Does it address a proven area of need? And we've talked about this already. Sometimes we know we want to serve in a certain way, maybe it aligns with our business, and we go forward with that, but we need to take the time to make sure that there is a true need that's going to be helpful and impactful for our communities.
Mhm.
Are your goals and outcomes aligned with your corporate strategy? The more aligned you are to your business strategy, the more relevant that your strategy stays in times of crisis. So no matter the ebb and flow of your business, if you have that clear alignment, then you're going to be able to be stable in your practice a lot more easily.
Mhm.
Then is there a clear path and process for providing the solutions that you're aiming to solve for? Does a strategy allow for iteration and adaptation over time? Because sometimes you can set a strategy, and then if you don't revisit it, your relevancy can decrease. Do you have the ability to measure your impact? Again, that's another holy grail question that everybody's trying to do and do well. And then do you have buy-in and active participation and support from your key stakeholders? If they're not engaged, there might be an issue or a challenge with them understanding the strategy, or it might indicate that your strategy isn't quite where it needs to be.
Mhm.
So those would be the key components to look at when you think about having a high quality strategy.
Well, and maybe you can speak a little bit to what are the elements of the strategy that you used in this time, side by side to the disaster recovery plan. Um,
Mhm.
that might be helpful. And maybe we can get to that here as we move along. But I think how you actually use both those components really matter,
Mhm.
help you to be
Yeah.
strategic.
Okay, let me try and answer this succinctly, because there's so many different layers to our giving, and I know we haven't talked about what our full response was just yet. I think a good example is looking at one of our key national partners, Boys and Girls Clubs of America. So we were in the process of finalizing a new 3-year multi-million-dollar grant with them that was supposed to launch on July 1st.
Got it.
Boys and Girls Clubs is our longest running partner. We've created this really amazing, robust experiential learning program, financial literacy program that is delivered to 2,800 clubs across the United States. And we had just delivered a modernized version of our curriculum that was years in the making, that went out the door, and then COVID hit. So clearly they went into crisis mode. Many of their clubs shut down. Some opened to provide essential social services, but our core programming was really put on hold, because at this point in time, we had to recognize that they weren't in a place to be able to deliver financial literacy programming when they were, again, in survival mode. So we reacted in a couple of different ways. So they were a part of our big national COVID response. I think it's always important that you consider your long-term partners when you're thinking about your disaster strategies and responses. Second, we decided to delay the new 3-year grant and do a short-term grant with them for the second half of the year. So we're providing them funding, but we're giving them the space and room to see how their operations normalize, and to remove some of the pressures of delivering our core program. At the same time, we're trying to help them prepare better to be ready to bring that program to their clubs as the clubs are looking to normalize and get back to regular programming and making sure that they are serving the needs of their kids. And we've also worked with them to think about how can some of our content maybe be delivered virtually during this time. So I think that's a good example about how we thought about our ongoing strategy, how it was impacted by COVID, and how we're thinking about continuing that very important relationship and be responsive to their needs.
Absolutely.
So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really valuing that partnership and understanding the change in times and being strategic about both what you could provide and what their needs were, and listening along the way. So that's what I hear really clearly. Let's see here. So I want to keep moving forward towards how you actually created that plan. And I'm interested in, you've spoken to a couple of these things, but if there's anything you want to add to, what informed your giving plan?
So I think tapping into the expertise of the team first and foremost, and really getting everybody involved in the evaluation and the research and the ideation to make sure that we were being as comprehensive and well thought out as possible. Of course, the research that I've already spoken to, again, making sure that we were responding to some of the most pressing critical needs, and that we were thinking about the needs of the national community as well as our local communities. The needs of our existing grantees, not just our big national partners, but even the small grant-making relationships that we have. How can we think about continuing to support them? And then I think listening to our stakeholders. And sometimes that's a piece of the puzzle that we miss when we're trying to move quickly. But it's so important to get buy-in and some consensus with key stakeholders at the right points in time and around the right components of your plan. Because if you get buy-in from your stakeholders early, that creates much easier engagement and deeper engagement once you actually launch your plan. So that was very important for us. And we looked at our stakeholders in terms of external stakeholders, so our nonprofit partners, the basic community needs, the thought leaders in the space, both people who are responding to the COVID need, and also thought leaders in the financial literacy space, and how are the needs of people thinking about their finances changing. And then our internal stakeholders, so our leadership, some other business units. We've been trying to work more effectively with our local business leaders and our community ambassadors who help bring our programs to life locally, and our employees in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you can kind of speak to both, what was the plan that you announced, and what did you hear was important to include in your giving plan?
Right. I think a couple of the things that we heard was really important was, first, to provide support in the locations where our employees and clients live and work. This disaster touched everybody in a way that very few disasters do, and we wanted to be able to really respond to the authentic desire of our employees to participate in our giving. We also needed to look at the needs of the United States as a whole and how we could respond to the root cause of the pandemic, and also the needs of the local communities who were affected by the pandemic. We wanted to also make sure that we were responding to the crisis without damaging our ability to serve our long-term mission and our ability to continue giving over time. That was a very important piece of advice and something that we heard from our leadership. We also heard that genuine desire for our employees to help, but mingled with uncertainty on how best to do this while they were adapting to their new normals, the shelter in place and having kids at home from school. So taking into consideration their personal needs as individuals along with their balancing their desire to give. And then we also looked at kind of the opportunity and need to adjust our whole communications and content strategy. So as opposed to pushing out information about our core financial literacy programs, how did we think about how we could provide advice to parents that were looking for ways to keep their kids educated and engaged at home, and utilizing our resources there? And so ultimately, that led us to, out of the gate, committing $1.25 million in direct COVID response. $500,000 went to local efforts in our 10 major employee centers, going to either food banks or community funds. $350,000 went to the CDC Foundation because they were on the ground fighting and responding to the actual impact of the virus itself, preparing health workers with the right tools and resources, helping inform people about how to stay safe, finding ways for testing and growing the health response. And then in looking at our partnerships, we donated $150,000 to the Boys and Girls Clubs of America Emergency Response Fund. In addition, to meet our employee needs, we launched our largest ever employee disaster match, which provides $250,000 for a 2-to-1 match to more than 1,200 different nonprofit organizations that were responding to the pandemic. And we offered that match on top of the regular 1-to-1 match that our employees get, so that they didn't have to choose between supporting the relief efforts or their favorite and nonprofits where they're most passionate. They can do both. And then we also had to cancel our annual volunteer week, which is a huge and beloved tradition at Schwab. This year we had planned for over 8,400 employees to volunteer with more than 350 nonprofits in over 170 cities across the US. Planning was well underway for that initiative. So now we're thinking about how we adapt and respond to volunteerism overall. But we also knew that our nonprofit partners that participated in that program were used to receiving a $1,000 grant for their participation in our volunteer week. So we chose to go ahead and honor those grants for all of the nonprofits where we had planned volunteer activities, which meant another nearly $300,000 going directly to our nonprofit partners, not necessarily ones just responding to COVID, to try and help with their long-term viability. And we continue to look for other ways to respond. Our response is not over.
Mhm. Wow. Wow. Did your budget, I mean, how were you able to pull together that to respond in that way? Because I imagine when we started the fiscal year for you, your budget didn't necessarily include this. So how did you make that happen?
So a couple things there. One, it goes back to our overall planning and our disaster response. So over the past couple of years, we have revised how we budget for disasters and created the right type of authority to be able to use the unused disaster funds from one year and carry it over into the next year. So last year, fortunately, we did not have a lot of use of that fund, so that gave us some more budget this year that we could deploy. We have also made sure that as part of our operational practices that we always have a minimum of about 3 months worth of operating funds in our reserves. And we were able to look at those reserves that are very healthy and tap into the reserves to provide the additional funding, as opposed to having to go back to the company to ask for more money, because we know businesses are also suffering as a result of the response. So ensuring over the long term that we were in a very healthy position allowed us to make some of these decisions, and we did not have to pull any money from our primary grant making pool. And that is such a relief, because we know that nonprofits are going to be suffering for a long time, and nonprofits that aren't just responding to COVID are going to have very great needs. So we feel very fortunate that we were able to do that and make sure we have continuity for our operations.
Wow, that's outstanding, and truly a testament to the pre-work and planning that you did, even though there was no fathom of this kind of scale or scope of crisis.
Right.
Yeah. When you went to then communicate the plan, what were the factors that you considered in communicating that plan, both internally and externally?
Well, I think first and foremost, we wanted to ensure that the timing and the tone was right. There was so much communication going out to our employees about how our operations were impacted by COVID. We wanted to make sure that their fundamental needs were the priority in our communications. We also wanted to make sure that we were very clear that the safety of our employees and our communities were also primary in our thoughts every step of the way in our plans, and that was also clear as we communicated out about our response. We wanted to make sure that we were crystal clear in describing our response, so that it was very easy to understand where our funding was going and how our nonprofit beneficiaries could activate their support, and make sure that we weren't creating a process that was burdensome for our beneficiaries, that it was really easy and simple for them to receive the support. And then making sure that we had the right level of action items in our communications, because people wanted to do something. So pointing them to the right resources in terms of how our employees, for example, could engage in the match, and making it very easy for them to do so.
Wow. You must have a lot of pride in, I don't want to put light on, the circumstances, but you must have a lot of pride in where you're at today relative to those first couple weeks. It seems like there was a lot of intentionality and listening and engaging the full team to really craft that opinion, make sure that you were hitting local, national level, and hearing the voices of your existing partners and really contributing to them. And just the overall intentionality and communication, and how you changed programming. I mean, there's so many things, Casey. You've got to have some level of pride in there.
I do. I think that I work with an amazing team of people, and we could not have done it without the passionate engagement of not only our team, but all of our employees, because we had so many great examples of small ways that our employees were stepping up to give that are now influencing how we're going to give collectively as an organization. And I think the pride comes from looking at the response we've seen from our employees and our partners, that there's just a sense of relief and gratitude that we were able to reach out to them proactively, and that we were really trying to be thoughtful about our approach and not become a barrier for them or burden them at a time when they are in survival mode. And then seeing the level of employee engagement with our giving campaign and the ongoing communications about other ideas on how we can continue to give and support. So the work that we do with the community services team and the foundation is on behalf of every single employee at Schwab. And so I just want to recognize that, you know, what we're able to do comes from them, comes from their passion, their talent, their skill, and their desire to be responsive to their communities. It's really amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I just hear a renewed sense of spirit in all of this, and definitely a lot of hard work to get here, but certainly worth the lift. So, Casey, I wanted to spend the last couple of minutes here just giving you some questions of what we've heard from other clients, quite honestly, questions that they have. I'd really like to hear your take on some of the answers and how you would respond to some of those questions. So first question is, how do we take on volunteering now and in the future? And maybe you can kind of share what you all are thinking.
So I think the most important thing is to set a plan now that allows for iteration, because what we think now in another month might be very different. And an example of that is we were scrambling right away to identify virtual volunteering opportunities because we knew people are remote, that they were showing the strong desire to give. And so we've been actively researching what some of those opportunities might be, again, wanting to make sure we're looking at organizations that are trusted, well-vetted opportunities that will be a good experience and meet high levels of needs. And we've heard from some of our corporate peers that already have launched virtual volunteering that they're not seeing a lot of engagement with those just yet. So while we're still continuing to look at that, we also know that people are looking to find ways to do small acts of service and ways that they can give individually. So we are looking at part of our renewed vision for volunteering to include potentially weekly acts of service challenges, where we can say, okay, this week, let's all think about the healthcare workers, and maybe we can all write notes of thanks and appreciation. Or after we start normalizing a bit, we still should be reaching out to our elderly neighbors and making sure that they're taken care of. So one weekly challenge might be going out and helping your elderly neighbor with grocery shopping or mowing lawns, et cetera. I think listening to your stakeholders, again, making sure you're not acting based on assumptions. So as we develop our new plan and vision for volunteering, we're getting to the point where we have enough of a framework built that we're going to bring in our ambassadors and people who have worked as our volunteer week leads and starting to vet ideas with them. How do they perceive virtual volunteering? We're looking at maybe more on-site volunteer opportunities so people, when they're getting back into their work routine, don't have to leave to go out and provide service. We're really trying to look at this as a test and learn environment, and that would be a recommendation I give to other people. That is an opportunity to try some things that you haven't been able to do before. But as you bring potentially new opportunities to your base, do regular pulse surveys so you can understand, are things working or not? And if you hear that things are not working, continue to get a feedback loop with your employees, what would work better? And again, back to my first comment about iteration and being able to adjust as needs change. And then finally, just looking at giving trends, like we're looking closely at where our employees have been putting their money with their regular matching campaign to see what causes are most important to our volunteers, and making sure we proactively bring in those opportunities into our volunteer plans.
I love that, using the data that you already have to help inform the craft. That's great. Another question that we're hearing is, you know, some foundations the asks are coming in and the giving capacity is much lower or could be completely eliminated. if you have any thoughts or ideas on prioritizing or handling that situation.
Mhm. Well, I think first it's important to recognize, respect, and validate the need, and respond very carefully and thoughtfully to people who are coming to you with requests. Try and respond to each one and be transparent about your ability to give. If you can't, you need to state that clearly and explain why. I think the other thing too is that you can think outside your normal constructs on how you might be able to give and think of some non-traditional ways to help. So one example that has come up in our research is thinking about pro bono assistance for nonprofits. They're going to be struggling to think about business continuity. Do you have experts in your firm that build your business continuity plans that you might be able to connect with some of your nonprofit partners and have them walk through that plan and provide some advice? Or having your human resources experts help nonprofits navigate staffing needs. So that's not normally a part of how we do volunteerism, but there's a real need there. So that might be a way, without using financial resources, that you can leverage your expertise to support some of these really basic foundational needs for nonprofits. And the other thing I think that is never a bad idea is to offer up other known resources. So if you can't support financially, but you need, an organization that might have the ability to give at this time or might be serving a specific social area, direct your requesters to those opportunities, and they'll appreciate just the fact that you're helping them look for fresh resources.
Yeah, I love that. I love that repurposing of assets that you already have, that might not always be financial resources, and just being a voice and being a partner through it all. So
Absolutely.
One other question I want to ask you, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today, but we've heard this from some clients and just in the community in general, but for organizations that say we're floundering as a business, and how do I get my leadership to care about corporate social responsibility and giving?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that always is tricky, whether it's a result of what's happening right now or just a struggle to get buy-in in regular operational times. And I think best practices apply in both environments. So one, I think it's important to clearly define what does CSR mean, or could it mean to your firm. I think the term itself is not universally defined, and oftentimes not having a common definition can create an automatic barrier for participation. So for you and your company, what do you mean when you say we should have a CSR strategy? I think use the current environment as an opportunity to showcase the importance and value right now on how giving and volunteerism can impact employee morale, can impact the need to come back together as teams once we return to our workplaces, how it can impact brand reputation and engagement overall. And I think that you can hold up other companies that your leadership views as a stellar example of a successful company, and showcase maybe some of their CSR efforts and how it's working for them, and bring data into that conversation, show the impact and the results of those efforts. I think that you can show some examples of potentially media coverage that companies who are doing it well are getting, as an example of how it might be able to advance your own brand reputation. The other thing is to really be crystal clear on key goals and objectives of what you might be proposing in terms of a CSR strategy. Identify the importance both to your business and to your community. And then you can find ways to test small programs. You don't have to come out of the gate with something really big. Maybe there's something that's organically happening that's purely employee driven that you could amplify and lift up to your leadership to say, look, this is happening already, and this is the impact that it's making. Think about what it would do if it was a more organized effort. And then finally, I'd say, even if you can find one leader who's an advocate, ask them to be a champion with you. So it's coming from somebody else in the business, not just you as a CSR professional or you as a volunteer professional where it's your core job to do it. Get an outside but internal voice and a leader in the firm that's respected to help be that advocate for you.
Thank you. I think that's so helpful. And Certainly not something to be overlooked in this time of need.
Mhm.
Casey, I cannot thank you enough for your time
Mhm.
today. What I heard so loud and clear was you taking account of the assets and the resources that you have in your purview. You leveraged your
Mhm.
strategy and looked at, even within the strategy you already had, how do you pivot considering the times, and how do you leverage that disaster
Mhm.
recovery plan, and even filling out the matrix to keep you grounded, and keep the emotion out of it as much as you can,
Mhm.
excuse me.
Yeah.
And then really including the voices of all of your stakeholders,
Mhm.
leadership, employees, nonprofits that you serve. I heard you talk about deepening the partnerships inside the organization and elevating the nonprofit partnerships that you have within the community. I just think you've done a great job, you and your team, to represent your brand, to give to the community, to be very intentional. And I'm just so impressed with what you and your team have done over these last few weeks, and what I know that you'll continue to do to be iterative and responsive. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your time and the work that you've been doing internally.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.